When HOA President Margaret Sullivan tried to use her master key to enter my house while screaming at 911 dispatch, she had no idea she was talking to my teenage son Danny, the same dispatcher who'd been secretly documenting her months of harassment and false police reports, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy her. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Ridge subdivision as I stood in my kitchen, sipping coffee and watching my neighbor Margaret Sullivan pace back and forth on her perfectly manicured lawn. For 3 years, she had made my life miserable as the self-appointed queen of our homeowners association. Today would be different. Today, karma would finally catch up with her. It all started when I moved into 1247 Oak Street with my teenage son Danny. As a single father working 2 jobs to afford our modest home, I thought I'd found paradise in this quiet neighborhood. The house needed work, but it was ours. What I didn't know was that Margaret Sullivan ruled this subdivision with an iron fist and a leather-bound HOA rulebook. Margaret was everything you'd expect from an HOA president who had too much time and too little purpose. Blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, designer clothes that cost more than my monthly mortgage, and a permanent scowl that seemed etched into her face. She drove a white BMW with vanity plates reading HO1, and treated every minor violation like a federal crime. The harassment began within my first week. A formal letter arrived in my mailbox, typed on official HOA letterhead, informing me that my mailbox was 3 inches too far to the left of center and needed immediate correction. The fine was $50. I measured. My mailbox was perfectly centered. The letters kept coming. My grass was allegedly half an inch too tall. My car was parked 2 degrees off parallel in my own driveway. My house number wasn't the approved font style. Each violation came with escalating fines and threats of legal action. When I tried to reason with Margaret, she stood on her front porch with her arms crossed, looking down at me like I was something she'd scrape off her shoe. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "rules are rules. If you can't follow simple guidelines, perhaps this neighborhood isn't the right fit for your lifestyle." The way she said lifestyle made it clear she wasn't just talking about my mailbox. Things escalated when she discovered I was working on my car in my garage. Apparently, automotive repair activities were prohibited, even on your own property. The fact that I was simply changing my oil didn't matter to Margaret. She stood at the end of my driveway with her phone, recording everything while lecturing me about property values. "This is a respectable neighborhood," she declared. "We don't need grease monkeys bringing down our home values." My son Danny, 17 and working part-time at the county 911 dispatch center, watched these confrontations with growing anger. He'd gotten the job through a program for responsible teens, and despite his age he was one of their most reliable dispatchers. The kid had always been mature beyond his years, especially after his mother passed away when he was 12. "Dad, why don't you fight back?" Danny asked one evening after Margaret had left another citation on our door. "She's breaking half the rules she claims to enforce. Her fence is 6 inches taller than regulations allow. She parks her BMW on the street during prohibited hours. She's even modified her mailbox with decorative elements that aren't in the approved style guide." I looked at my son, surprised by his detailed knowledge. "How do you know all that?" Danny shrugged. "I've been documenting everything. Every time she harasses us, every violation she commits herself. Someone needs to keep records." But Margaret's worst offense was yet to come. 3 months after we moved in, I received the most ridiculous citation yet. Margaret claimed I had unauthorized modifications to my home because I'd replaced my broken doorbell. Not installed a new doorbell, replaced a broken one with an identical model. When I knocked on her door to discuss this obvious mistake, she opened it just wide enough to sneer at me through the gap. "The doorbell you installed is brushed nickel. The approved style is polished chrome. You'll need to replace it immediately or face escalating fines." "Margaret, this is insane. It's the exact same doorbell that was here when I bought the house." "Don't take that tone with me," she snapped. "I know what I saw. You people always try to bend the rules." "You people?" The phrase hit me like a slap. Now her true colors were showing. "You know exactly what I mean," she said, starting to close the door. I put my hand against it, not forcefully, just to keep it from slamming shut. "No, Margaret. I don't know what you mean. Why don't you explain it to me?" Her face twisted with ugly anger. "Get your hands off my door right now or I'm calling the police." I immediately stepped back, hands raised. "I'm not touching anything. I just want to understand why you're targeting my family." But Margaret had already slammed the door. Through the window I could see her grabbing her phone. 20 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived at my house. I explained the situation calmly, and they were professional but clearly annoyed at being called for such a trivial matter. After they left, I felt defeated. Margaret had found a way to make me look like the aggressor. That night, Danny came home from his shift at the dispatch center with fire in his eyes. "Dad, I heard about today." "How did you?" The officers filed their report and dispatch logs everything. Margaret filed a false complaint. She told 911 that you were aggressively trying to break into her home, and that she feared for her safety from the hostile neighbor. I felt my blood pressure rising. "She what?" "I have the recording, Dad. She was screaming about how you were trying to force your way into her house, how you were making threats." Complete lies. For the first time in months, I saw my son's composure crack. Danny had always been the calm one, the voice of reason. But Margaret had pushed too far. "There's something else," Danny continued. "I've been monitoring her calls to 911. Over the past 6 months, she's called in 37 complaints about various neighbors. Noise violations that don't exist, parking infractions she made up, suspicious activity reports for people walking their dogs. She's abusing the emergency system." I stared at my son. 37 calls? The officers are getting tired of it. I've heard them complaining about that crazy HOA lady on Oak Street. But she keeps calling and they have to respond. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. I was at work when my phone rang. Danny's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Dad, you need to come home. Now." "What happened?" "Margaret happened. I broke several speed limits getting home. When I turned onto Oak Street, I saw 2 police cars in my driveway and Margaret standing on her lawn, gesturing wildly while talking to the officers. Danny met me at my car, his jaw clenched. She called 911 claiming someone broke into our house. She said she saw suspicious individuals entering through the back door and that she feared they were stealing everything." "What suspicious individuals?" "You and me, Dad. We were the suspicious individuals. She apparently didn't recognize us coming home to our own house. One of the officers approached us, looking embarrassed. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm sorry about this. We have to respond to all break-in calls, but it's pretty clear this was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I looked over at Margaret, who was now talking to the second officer with theatrical hand gestures. "Officer, this woman has been harassing my family for months. This is the 4th time she's called police on us for absolutely nothing." The officer nodded sympathetically. "We're aware of the situation. Miss Sullivan is a frequent caller. Is there anything we can do?" "Document everything. If you can prove she's filing false reports, you can press charges." After the police left, I sat on my front steps feeling completely defeated. Margaret had won. She'd made our lives so miserable that I was seriously considering selling the house and moving somewhere else. Danny sat beside me, unusually quiet. "Dad," he finally said, "I have an idea." I looked at my son, seeing something in his expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was cold, calculating determination. "What kind of idea?" "The kind that stops this permanently." Danny's plan was simple but brilliant. As a 911 dispatcher, he had access to call records, response reports, and detailed information about complaint patterns. More importantly, he knew exactly how the system worked and what constituted abuse of emergency services. "Here's what we're going to do," Danny explained that evening, spreading papers across our kitchen table. "We're going to give Margaret exactly what she wants, the police attention she craves. But this time she's going to be the one in trouble." Danny had compiled 3 months of Margaret's 911 calls, complete with timestamps, officer responses, and outcomes. The pattern was damning: 37 calls, 0 legitimate emergencies, and increasingly frustrated reports from responding officers. "But how does this help us?" "Because, Dad, I'm going to make sure her next call to 911 is her last." Danny's opportunity came sooner than expected. The following Saturday, I was in my garage organizing tools when I heard Margaret's shrill voice from next door. She was yelling at someone on the phone, and her words carried clearly across our adjoining property line. "I don't care what time it is. There are people making noise and I demand you send officers immediately. This is unacceptable." I checked my watch. It was 2:30 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon. I was literally the only person making any noise, and I was quietly organizing my toolbox in my own garage. 20 minutes later, Danny's phone rang. He was in his room, officially off duty but monitoring the police scanner out of habit. When he answered, I heard him use his professional dispatcher voice. 911, what's your emergency? Even from downstairs, I could hear Margaret's voice screeching through the phone. "This is Margaret Sullivan at 1248 Oak Street. My neighbor is making excessive noise, and I demand immediate police response." "Ma'am, can you describe the nature of the noise disturbance?" "He's banging and crashing around in his garage. It's been going on for hours." Danny glanced at me through his bedroom window. I was holding a single screwdriver and hadn't made a sound in 10 minutes. "Ma'am, I'm showing this is your 7th call this month regarding noise complaints. Are you certain this constitutes an emergency requiring immediate police response?" "Don't you dare question me, young man. I know my rights. Send officers immediately, or I'll report you to your supervisor." This was Danny's moment. As a trained dispatcher, he knew exactly how to handle abusive callers. More importantly, he knew Margaret had no idea who she was talking to. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that filing false reports is a misdemeanor offense. Are you certain you want officers to respond to investigate a noise complaint at 2:30 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon?" "False report? How dare you? I'm the HOA president, and I'm reporting a legitimate violation." "Ma'am, HOA violations are civil matters, not police emergencies. Using 911 for non-emergency civil disputes is considered abuse of emergency services." Margaret's voice rose to a shriek. "I don't care about your policies. Send police now or I'll have your job." Danny's voice remained perfectly calm and professional. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to verify your address and the exact nature of your emergency." 1248 Oak Street, "and my emergency is that my neighbor refuses to follow HOA rules." "And what is your name for the report?" "Margaret Sullivan, and I demand to speak to your supervisor." "One moment please." Danny put the call on hold and walked downstairs to where I was standing in the garage doorway, having heard most of the conversation. "Dad, she just admitted on a recorded 911 line that she's calling police for HOA violations, not actual emergencies. That's abuse of emergency services." "What happens now?" Danny smiled. "Now she gets exactly what she's been asking for, police attention." Danny returned to the phone. "Ma'am, I've consulted with my supervisor. Officers are being dispatched to your location to investigate your complaint." "Finally. And I want them to arrest that man for disturbing the peace." "Ma'am, I need to inform you that when officers arrive, they'll also be investigating your pattern of emergency service calls. Please be prepared to provide documentation of the emergency that prompted today's call." There was a long pause. "What do you mean, pattern of calls?" "Our records show 37 911 calls from your address in the past 6 months. Officers need to determine if these calls represent legitimate emergencies or potential abuse of the system." Margaret's voice suddenly became uncertain. I don't understand. I only call when there are real problems." "Ma'am, officers will review each incident when they arrive. Please remain available for questioning." Danny hung up and immediately called his supervisor on the official line, explaining the situation and requesting that responding officers be briefed on Margaret's call history and the potential for filing charges. 30 minutes later, 2 police cars pulled up to our street. But instead of stopping at my house, they went directly to Margaret's front door. Danny and I watched from our window as officers spent 45 minutes interviewing Margaret on her front porch. We could see her becoming increasingly agitated as the conversation continued. At one point, she pointed dramatically at our house and appeared to be shouting. The officers remained calm and professional, taking notes and occasionally speaking into their radios. Finally, one of the officers walked over to our house and knocked on the door. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm Officer Martinez. We need to ask you a few questions about the noise complaint filed against you today." "Of course, officer." "Were you making excessive noise in your garage around 2:30 this afternoon?" I gestured to my organized toolbox and clean garage. I was quietly organizing my tools. "I can't imagine how that would constitute excessive noise." Officer Martinez nodded. "That's consistent with what we observed. We also noticed that your garage is well insulated and faces away from Miss Sullivan's house. Any noise from normal activity would be minimal. Is there anything else I can help you with?" "Actually, yes. We understand you've had ongoing issues with Miss Sullivan filing complaints against you?" I glanced at Danny, who nodded encouragingly. "Officer, she's filed dozens of false complaints over the past few months. HOA violations she's made up, noise complaints for normal daytime activities, even claiming we were suspicious individuals breaking into our own home. We're aware of the pattern. I want you to know that we take abuse of emergency services very seriously. Ms. Sullivan has been informed that continued false reporting will result in criminal charges." "What happens now?" Officer Martinez looked back toward Margaret's house, where she was still talking animatedly to his partner. Now she faces the consequences of treating 911 like her personal complaint hotline. After the officers left, our street was quiet for the first time in months. Margaret's car remained in her driveway, but we didn't see her outside for the rest of the day. That evening, Danny came home from his official shift with an update. "Dad, Margaret called 911 two more times after the officers left." "About what?" "First, she called to complain that the officers were rude and unprofessional, and demanded they be disciplined. Then she called back an hour later to report that you were smugly standing in your driveway, clearly planning something suspicious." "I had been getting the mail." "What happened?" "Both calls were flagged as non-emergency abuse. She's been officially warned that any further inappropriate calls will result in immediate arrest for misuse of emergency services." "And if she calls again?" Danny's smile was cold and satisfied. "If she calls again, I'll be the one answering. And this time, instead of sending officers to investigate her complaints, they'll be coming to arrest her." The next morning brought an unexpected development. I found an envelope under my door, not a formal HOA citation, but a handwritten note on Margaret's personal stationery. "Mr. Rodriguez," it read, "upon further review, I've determined that your property is in full compliance with all HOA regulations. Please disregard any previous notices. Sincerely M. Sullivan, HOA President." I stared at the note in disbelief. After months of harassment, Margaret was suddenly backing down? Danny read the note and laughed. "Dad, she's terrified. She knows she's one phone call away from being arrested." "But why the complete turnaround?" "Because she finally met someone who understands the system better than she does. All those months of bullying us, she never imagined she was messing with a 911 dispatcher's family." Over the following weeks, the transformation was remarkable. Margaret still patrolled the neighborhood with her clipboard, but she avoided our house entirely. She still sent out HOA notices, but nothing directed at us. Most importantly, she stopped calling 911. The real test came a month later when I decided to paint my front door. The old paint was peeling and the door needed attention. I chose the exact same color, forest green, but Margaret didn't know that. I watched from my window as she stood on her lawn, staring at my house with her phone in her hand. For 20 minutes she paced back and forth, clearly debating whether to call the police about an unauthorized door color change. Finally she put her phone away and went inside. Danny found this hilarious. "She wanted to call so badly, but she knows I'm monitoring dispatch. One more fake call and she's spending the night in jail." The ultimate vindication came 3 months later when Margaret's abuse of the 911 system finally caught up with her in a way none of us expected. I was at work when Danny called, barely able to contain his excitement. "Dad, you're not going to believe this." "What happened?" "Margaret just called 911 to report a burglary in progress at the Henderson house. She claimed she saw masked men breaking in through the back door. The Hendersons lived 3 houses down from us, and Mr. Henderson was a retired police sergeant." "Let me guess, it wasn't a burglary?" "It was Mr. Henderson and his son doing home repairs. They were wearing dust masks and entered through the back door because they were carrying paint cans. Margaret saw them from her window and immediately assumed the worst." "What happened when officers responded?" Danny's voice was filled with satisfaction. "Officer Martinez was the responding unit. When he realized it was another false call from Margaret Sullivan, he arrested her on the spot for abuse of emergency services." I sat in stunned silence. After months of harassment and false reports, Margaret had finally been held accountable. "There's more, Dad." When they searched her house for evidence of her 911 abuse, they found something interesting. "What?" "She had a master key to every house in the subdivision. Apparently she'd been using it to enter people's homes when they weren't there, looking for HOA violations." My blood ran cold. "She had a key to our house?" "That is right." Breaking and entering charges were added to the abuse of emergency services. "She's looking at serious jail time." The story broke in the local newspaper 2 days later. HOA president arrested for home invasions, 911 abuse. The article detailed Margaret's pattern of harassment, her abuse of emergency services, and the discovery of her illegal entry into residents' homes. But the most satisfying part was the quote from the arresting officer. "This case was solved thanks to the diligent work of our dispatch team, who recognized a pattern of abuse and took appropriate action to protect our community." Danny never sought credit for his role in Margaret's downfall, but I knew the truth. My 17-year-old son had used his knowledge, patience, and professional training to bring down a bully who thought she was untouchable. Margaret's house went up for sale a week after her arrest. She couldn't make bail and was facing felony charges for multiple counts of breaking and entering, plus misdemeanor charges for abuse of emergency services. The day the for sale sign went up in her yard, Danny and I stood in our driveway, watching the moving truck load her possessions. "You know what the best part is?" Danny said. "What's that?" She never knew who she was really messing with. All those months of harassment, she thought she was dealing with just another neighbor she could push around. She had no idea she was targeting the family of the person who would eventually take her down. I put my arm around my son's shoulder, feeling proud beyond words. Danny had shown more maturity and strategic thinking than most adults I knew. "What made you think of using her own calls against her?" Danny shrugged. "You taught me that bullies only understand one thing: consequences. Margaret spent months trying to use the system against us. I just made sure the system worked the way it was supposed to." As we watched the moving truck drive away, I realized that justice had been served in the most perfect way possible. Margaret Sullivan, who had spent years abusing her position of power to make other people's lives miserable, was finally facing the consequences of her actions. And the person who brought her down was the same kid she tried to intimidate with her threats and citations. The quiet teenager who worked part-time at 911 dispatch and understood exactly how to make the system work for justice instead of harassment. Margaret learned too late that when you abuse your power long enough, eventually you'll target someone who knows how to fight back. The new neighbors who moved into Margaret's house 6 months later were a lovely retired couple who actually read the HOA rules and followed them reasonably. They introduced themselves with homemade cookies and genuine smiles. Our subdivision was peaceful again. But sometimes late at night, I still think about that moment when Margaret screamed at my 17-year-old son over the phone, demanding he send police to arrest his own father for the crime of organizing tools in his own garage. She never knew she was sealing her own fate with every word.